everyone. I am Chirag Thakkar, and you're watching Roli Pulse, a digital initiative by Roli Books. Since the lockdown began, we at Roli have been bringing you author interactions, author videos, panel discussions, live chats with your favorite writers, artists, public intellectuals, sportspersons, journalists, among others. And today's conversation is on how can India revive its economy post-COVID. We have with us T.N. Ninan, Omkar Goswami, in conversation with Mihir Sharma. T.N. Ninan is the chairman of Business Standard Limited. During a quarter at the helm of different publications, he's been editor of Business Standard, where he was also publisher from 1996, the Economic Times and Business World. He's been president of the Editors Guild of India, chairman of the Media Committee of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and chairman of the Society for Environmental Communication. We have with us Omkar Goswami, who is a well-known economist and business journalist. He's the founder and chairperson of Corporate and Economic Research Group Advisory Private Limited, which is engaged in corporate advisory and consulting services for companies in India and abroad. He has served as advisor on several government committees and international organizations like the World Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the International Monetary Fund, and the Asian Development Bank. And Ninan and Omkar are going to be in conversation with Mihir Sharma, who is a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and head of its Economy and Growth Program. Trained as an economist and political scientist in Delhi and Boston, Mihir has also co-edited What the Economy Needs Now with Abhijit Banerjee, Geeta Gopinath, and Raghuram Rajan. He is also the India columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, on the editorial board of Business Standard, and an Aspen Fellow. So welcome to Roli Pulse, Ninan, Omkar, and Mihir. I hope you enjoy this chat. And I'll just hand over to Mihir to dive right into this discussion.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. We're talking today about how India will be able to revive its economy post-COVID-19. But of course, that's it's an almost presumptuous topic because it's difficult to imagine right now when this sort of post-COVID-19 period might begin. We're still in the middle of the second phase of the lockdown. So let's start with a very simple question. Maybe Omkar, you can take this. When do you think the lockdown will actually end? And what is your sense of the current plan for a phased exit in various different areas?
Well, let me put it this way. If the lockdown were to continue beyond 3rd of May, which, I mean, a couple of states have said, so Telangana wants to take it up to the 6th of May, if I'm not mistaken. But if the lockdown were to continue beyond 3rd of May, it would be economic lunacy. Because today, the situation is that a vast number of people, both in small industries, small businesses, shopkeepers, have had no work whatsoever. Laborers, both in urban and in semi-urban areas, construction workers are completely without any jobs, livelihood. The economy has slumped and will continue slumping. I think the epidemiological concerns now don't have to take a back seat, but you have to now really measure that against the economic hardships and the livelihood concerns. And as far as I'm concerned, and I made this quite clear, while I was okay with 2 phases of lockdown, I absolutely am in favor of opening up. My next point to you, and we can discuss this later, we will, if you think of a great plan, a great, perfect, incentive-compatible plan of how to do phased opening up, you will never do it. I mean, at the end of the day, people who are figuring out that plan and executing that plan are civil servants at different levels. So I would actually be less in favor of this greatly worked out phased opening up, and instead open up and allow the logistics of people moving into work to determine the speed at which things actually start getting going. with all the safeties, with all the possible safeties that you have, the masks, the sanitizers, but just stop designing what is the optimal phased opening up. Because by the time you do that, you would have lost another month.
Mr. Ninan, they've had a month to think about the how to design an opening up, though. I mean, surely there's some sense that they might have of where the current hotspots are, the kind of restrictions that they might want in one place versus another.
Here, the lockdown question has to be related to the number of cases coming under control. And while there is a slowing down of the rate of doubling of cases, the latest rate is about 9 days doubling. We were at about 25,000 today. We were 12,000 and odd 9 days ago. And I presume that that will continue to slow down further. But if you were to project that at any kind of reasonable rate, I think we will end up somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 cases before it begins to flatten out completely. This is guesswork. Nobody's been in this territory before. But the way I see it, that's roughly where I think we are headed. So that's 3 to 4 times the number of cases that we have today. So you have to imagine what the load on the government system, the medical infrastructure, the sense of a second wave, all of those issues come into play before the government will feel confident about fully lifting a lockdown. So frankly, I don't see a complete lifting of the lockdown in the foreseeable future because the situation is not under control. And it will be in phases. Different states will do it differently. There will be rollbacks, I mean, going back to tightening up and then loosening again. So that's the kind of scenario that you see. Basically, from the economic point of view, I think the first quarter, which is April, June, is a write-off. And then you have to look beyond that as to where it's headed. Just to do a quick comment on that, I think the most important point to recognize is that we are in a new phase. And we should not expect a reversal to meaning whatever was the pace at which things were going on before, let us not look to that happening again because it will not. Too much has changed. If you just look at government finances, if you look at what's happened to small and medium enterprises, you look at the CMI numbers on unemployment, which are 24, 25, 26%. And just for comparison, the peak US unemployment in the Great Depression was about 25%. So you are talking about devastation on a scale we've never seen. And if you see the numbers on 60% drop in oil imports, 40-50% drop in electricity consumption in places. The Delhi Deputy Chief Minister has talked about a 90% drop in revenue. There is no revenue for governments. Their finances are in a total mess. So, you know, to get back to any kind of normalcy, to assume that we can do that in a quarter or two is really to not recognize what we are living through.
So there are a couple of points there that I think we need to sort of follow up on. First, there's this question of as somebody's pointed out, there is a very good chance of a certain amount of seasonality to how COVID-19 will play itself out. It's possible that it is not transmitting person to person as swiftly right now as it might again in October, November, December of this year. So I think the question that we have to ask now is that even if we open up now and we're just getting back, if not to normal, the pre-COVID normal, to some kind of new normal, and we may have to shut down again in the third quarter of this financial year, basically the year will be a write-off.
Well, we don't know. My sense is that if we were to stop at 75,000 to 100,000 cases, we would have done very well. We wouldn't be in the top 10 countries. We would barely be in the top 15 countries. For the country with virtually the largest population in the world, that is doing amazingly well. So
No,
let's recognize that.
absolutely, but there will be, but it won't stop at 75 to 100 if the lockdown goes up. I mean, it goes away. One can assume that there will be a higher number of infections, and you're stabilizing at a much higher plateau after that. But I want to sort of follow up on the question about the point that you raised about unemployment. If you're talking at unemployment of, I think the CMI numbers were both urban and rural above 20%. In some sense, at this time for the rural economy, it's particularly tough because this is the time where you would be absorbing people for sort of the sowing season. The harvest season has just finished, the sowing season is just beginning. What's the sort of, if there is a significantly lower agricultural output for the next few months, given that you will have sown maybe less than you would have expected, acreage maybe less than expected, is there going to be some way in which we can immediately address rural distress? Omkar.
Yep. So it's very straightforward. The harvest should be all right. Even if there is a shortfall in harvest, which I don't think it will be, but if there is any significant shortfall in harvest, it might be in places where they still couldn't get enough labor in place to do the harvesting. But the sowing may be less than before, but we have, as far as consumers of food are concerned, we have enough stock of food grains in India today. So from the consumer point of view, I don't think we need to worry. We need to figure out how to release these stocks expeditiously and to people who need them the most. There I have my issues because as we keep on doing this through the state, and by definition, this has to be mostly done through the state, you're going to have too many differences because, it's going to be a variation of the license, control, and permit Raj. Do understand this, that in a terrible situation such as this, only the state can take care of things in a significant way for a large number of people. But when they do so, they will use all manner of their own view of what is right and what cannot be done. And it will continue for a while. But as far as agriculture is concerned, you may get on the Kharif crop, you may get a lower outturn, but it's not going to be devastating. What is going to be devastating, and you can wipe out. Ninan said, wipe out the first quarter. You can pretty much get close to wiping out Q2, because even if you take aside the red districts, the super red districts, even if you were to allow people to come back, and the only way people can come back to work is actually if you have train services ready for them in a systematic way. But even if you allow people to come back to work, you are going to see May and June, even by the end of June, you probably not even have 10% of the workforce, 10% of the workers. So therefore your output, whatever you produce in goods and services, is going to be constrained by a big amount. So the first quarter, forget about it, as Ninan said, you're getting nothing. You're also going to have nothing in the second quarter. If we have all the luck in the world, we'll see the uptick in the third quarter. My sense is similar to at least 3 economists that I heard a few days ago, that we are going to see a drop in real GDP, real gross domestic product growth, from roughly 5.5% for the year that just came to an end, 2021, to something like minus 0.4, 0.5% for 21-22. That is going to be the second worst drop in India, the worst being the drop between 79-80 and 80-81. So we have to be, and in addition to what Ninan said, we have to be looking at an enormous pressure on the exchequer. And we have to figure out ways in which how we can put in something between 5 to 6% of GDP on relief and bringing.
I'll come to the sort of broad question of the deficit in government finances in a moment. But I want to sort of drill down on this question of, even if we do spend, how are we going to be able to get it to the people who need it? Now, one of the ways in which you could conceivably get about sort of this whole rationing and access and paperwork problem that comes with sort of state relief is universalization. So why can't we universalize sort of access to the PDF? Why can't we start thinking at this point about something like at least a temporary universal basic income?
Absolutely true, Mihir, and I'll just say this and stop. Absolutely true. If you are going to use the local government to decide whether Mihir or Ninan or Omkar should get PDS depending according to the records and the papers they have, you're going to have a disaster zone. Just universalize it for at least 6 months. We have the stocks, just universalize it. Whoever comes, some of them will come twice. That's okay. Some might even come thrice. Just think of this. I'll give you a picture to think of. Think of the people who are in large refugee camps and the food comes in 3 trucks. People don't stand in line. They rush to the trucks. There should be enough food. There should be given. They should, and simply stop all this. That is your Aadhaar card up to date and is your fingerprint okay? Just stop it.
Mr. Ninan, why do you think they aren't universalizing things? I mean, several people have made this suggestion for a couple of weeks. In fact, people have even suggested that the government start talking to NGOs to help them distribute stocks that are in the PDF. Why is there this sort of mental block about universalization?
No, let me first say that I completely agree with Omkar that you should at the moment do universal distribution, particularly of food items, cooked, raw, whatever form. You have to universalize that and try and get it to everybody. To the extent possible, you need to universalize the distribution of money. I don't think you can reach everybody, but in fact, you may not reach the bottom 1/4 or most of the bottom 1/4. But I think some kind of cash distribution you need to universalize at the moment. But I have always believed that India is not at a stage where you can think of a comprehensive welfare system or a universal basic income. You have to recognize the universal basic income will come on top of all the existing welfare measures. Anyone who thinks that you can substitute them is living in dreamland. It will come on top of it, and it is simply unaffordable. By whatever calculation you make, it is simply unaffordable. And at a time when the government's finances are being devastated, and the numbers, I mentioned some of them, we've seen a 20% drop in GST in March before the lockdown, was only in the last 1 week. I don't know what the GST numbers will be now. You had chief ministers complaining all over the place that they simply have no cash. When government finances are being devastated like this, to say that it must take on the load of a permanent universal basic income simply makes no sense.
No, and Mihir, I want to make this very clear that all I am talking about is universalization for a 3 to 6 month period, no further than 6 months going forward. And I'm not even necessarily talking of cash because that might be very difficult to do. I'm certainly talking about basic food.
And I completely agree with you.
Yeah. So
and no further than that, because we can't afford it.
No, when unemployment is 25%, And let's remind ourselves what these numbers mean. 25% is 100 million people.
Yeah.
And they're at the bottom. I mean, and your poverty headcount has probably doubled in the process.
Yeah.
You know, so we are talking of an extreme situation where you can't be counting the cost on specific measures. You have to throw the kitchen sink at it. So you have to universalize. So for 3 to 6 months, of course, I agree. Beyond that, this larger question of people saying we must create a welfare system at $2,000 per capita income, it is simply not possible.
So let's talk for a moment then about the point that you already made, Mr. Ninan, about government finances. There are a couple of questions here. The first is that the GST was already underperforming. As you pointed out, now with the sort of freeze on economic activity, we can only imagine how low it's going to go in the past months. And it's going to continue to be at a fairly low level even as we very slowly recover. The question that I think that a lot of people are asking is, can we at this point be concerned about what sort of deficit the government is going to run up in the coming year? And if your answer is no, we can't, what happens if we get downgraded?
I don't see any escape. The government does not have the money. This is a fact. For anything that you're discussing about doing, the government does not have the money. So, and I don't think it can borrow on the scale required in the market to deal with the situation. I mean, the budget already provided for 8 trillion as a borrowing program, net borrowing program. You're going to talk about going from 8 to 11 or 12 trillion. There simply aren't enough savings in the market to absorb that kind of borrowing program by the government. And if there are, then your interest rates are going to shoot up, private sector activity will come down, and it's going to be negative. So the Reserve Bank will have to print money for the first time in 20 years to finance government activity. And mind you, it's not just the center, it's also the states who are also being devastated. If you look at your largest sources of revenue, liquor shut down, the oil sector as a whole, 50%, 60% drop in imports is what they're saying. Consumption drop reports are 40, 50%. Your automobile sector, you allowed the factories to reopen. But as the Maruti chairman said the other day, what's the point of asking me to open my factory? None of my hundreds of component suppliers are open. The ports are not working. My workers are not there. How am I supposed to start? So this is going to take 3 to 6 months to work its way out. And so to think of government finances in that situation, your largest sources of revenue are all crippled. Sometimes we don't realize what we're dealing with.
Omkar, do you agree?
Completely. I think the kindest estimate, and I would use the word kindest, the kindest estimate that we are looking at is, as of now, Nirmala Sitharaman has put in vaguely 1% of GDP as stimulus. How much of that stimulus is actually reaching people, I have my doubts, but that's what she's announced. The kindest estimate that we should be looking at is somewhere in the region of 6% of nominal GDP as a stimulus over a 7-8 month period, 8-10 month period. Look at each one of these things, as Ninan said. The states are completely bereft of GST money. They are having a huge cost in terms of dealing with the crisis and the pandemic. The increase in the ways and means advances, while it has been done by the Reserve Bank of India, is thoroughly inadequate. And we actually have no hope, as Ninan said, given the situation of the deficit, and we have to print money. Now, the point is, the question that we really need to ask is, what will this printing of money do to inflation? And my bet is, and so do many other economists believe, that in the first 6 months going forward, it's not going to affect inflation. By that time, if the wheels of supply start creaking back, which is what we will need, as Ninan's quite right, we will need 6 months for the wheels of supply to creep back to 50-55% of capacity. If that, maybe longer. But by that time that takes place, we probably will not have, in the second half, any inflation to worry about. We certainly won't have any in the first half. So the basic issue is North Block, which is the Ministry of Finance, is really scared of taking the order of telling RBI, now forget it, now print money. There are just too many people who are dealing with a playbook that is defined by the fiscal responsibility and budget management, all of that, the FRBM Act, X, Y, and Z. Now, while there should be long-term caution, this is not the time to deal with the playbook.
You're both quite completely wrong about this. You're right, of course, that there's going to be no immediate inflationary impact. But this reminds me of the kind of thing that I heard in 2009, 2010. Forget about it. This is a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. Reduce excise as much as you want. Lend as much as you can. We're still dealing with the outcome of that kind of mistake. And what is being suggested if you say that the government, that the RBI should go back on 2 decades of institutional progress and start answering to the government in New Delhi, is not inflation now. What you're saying is that we are moving back to a high inflation economy after two decades of enormous pain trying to change inflationary expectations. There's got to be another way.
You tell me the way.
Well, as Mr. Ninan has pointed out,
tell me, there are only 3 ways.
We don't have enough domestic savings.
There's only 3 ways.
Yeah.
Tap into the domestic savings, borrow, and print money. There are no other ways, right? So you tell me, given the constraints that we have now, and given that we need probably a fiscal and monetary stimulus put together of an additional 5% of GDP, I'm assuming that 1% is a given, which Mrs. Sitaraman has already done. You tell me, how do you finance it?
You have to borrow, and you have to borrow from abroad. And
there is no borrowing from the borrowing from abroad on that one is going to be virtually, that door is going to not be shut, but it's going to be as close to being shut over the next 2 quarters, or at least a quarter and a half.
Why do you think that?
Because there is no money goes to where it's safe. Unless you want to put a huge risk premium on offer and a foreign exchange premium on offer, it's not going to come.
And I absolutely agree with you. And I think that is in fact cheaper in the long run than returning to a world of fiscal dominance where the RBI is told by the central government what to do.
No, I just want to know how. I mean, you're saying borrow from abroad. Borrow from abroad where? Who? 5% of GDP, 5% of nominal GDP that we additionally need, assuming 6% is the ballpark, and 1% has been given, or at least, at least kept aside. Where do we borrow? How do we finance it?
Mr. Ninan, do you feel that there is no risk premium at which we will be able to borrow money on the world markets?
No, there is a risk premium that's going to be quite high. Now, it's a question of what is a given, a high risk premium that you have got to give on a higher interest rate as well as on a foreign exchange cover today, which is locked in, and you know that it's locked in, or on the balance printing, on which we don't know how the inflation will play out. What we do know is that this is a one-off. I can go right back to all the good things that Rangarajan and others did when the time that they did it 20 years ago, and hold it right back from next year.
Mr. Ninan, is there such a thing as a one-off when you give power to the central government?
I think I wrote somewhere, I wrote in Business Standard that one-offs tend to have the bad habit of becoming bad habits. So the tendency is always to then repeat what you've already done. But so I would be careful. I also think that the cost of loose behavior is disproportionate on emerging market economies when you compare it with the centers of finance. So your risks are greater, and that is what Ujit Patel, the former governor of the RBI, has already pointed out. And I find that he's being consulted by the Prime Minister and others. So clearly, and my own reading of Mr. Modi is that he is a fiscal conservative. I imagine that he will act with caution. We've already seen how limited the government's spending response has been to this crisis. It's much smaller than so many other countries. So I think there would be an element of caution in the way they deal with it. And so my sort of the lesson I draw from this is that the poor will suffer. They will suffer for quite a while. I mean, the cost is always disproportionate on those who have no reserves. So, you know, there will be pain, and we're going to have to live through it.
Mihir, I agree. Mihir, before you ask a question, I agree with Ninan. What I was saying is what I believe we ought to do with a certain set of risks. But I agree with Ninan that I don't expect an incremental stimulus, financial, monetary and fiscal, of an incremental 5% of GDP. I expect it to be much more sparse. Everyone is worried in government. Everyone. I'll just give you a simple example. There is a to try and increase additional money going to states outside of the ways and means advances. And I know for a fact that everyone is giving you reasons why it should not be done. Because they are all worried of money going out, right? And they're all worried of exactly what you are worried about and Ninan is worried about. So I think this is not going to happen. And therefore, the suffering and the difficulties will continue longer. And therefore, you can pretty much wipe out, not just first quarter is wiped out, you can wipe out the second quarter, and you'd be lucky to see limping growth in the third quarter. But more than that, you'll find a lot more problems of people having livelihoods.
So I think that
Mihir, if I can just come in on this, we must not lose sight of what is going on in the financial sector and the risk of financial contagion all over again. When a mutual fund completely closes shop and creates panic in the entire debt market after the stock market has fallen 30%, the risk of mutual fund default, what that will do to individual savings behavior. We are treading on dangerous ground, and you have to be very careful what you do, how you build confidence in the system, how you retain confidence in the system. These are scary times.
Mr. Ninan, what do you feel is going to be sort of impact on banks? A lot of people worry that, in the past couple of years, the safest part of bank lending has been retail lending. But there's good reason to assume that in this crisis in particular, small retail loans are not going to be as safe as they traditionally have been. Sorry?
I think that story is over. When I said that we're not going to go back to where we were, this is one of the things that will now change. Nobody's buying cars.
Yeah.
Nobody's buying houses. What retail lending are you going to do?
So, I mean, where is, are we looking at a situation where just as we were emerging from, a long and drawn out NPA crisis, we have a situation where banks basically have no healthy part of their loan book to look at?
Yeah, I don't see growth in lending because banks are going to be risk averse in this situation.
See, but Mihir, it's particularly the case with, I'll tell you, I think we should make some distinction between the banks. Today, the percentage of credit of the public sector banks is about what, 60?
Yeah, 63, 62.
So I think the public sector banks will be super, super careful. They will stay, they got into retail in only recently, relatively recently. They found they did quite well, some of them, some didn't, but now they're going to be super careful and they will hold back. What is even worse, I think, for public sector banks is when the small enterprises come back to work and they ask for one round or two rounds of working capital assistance against the orders that they're going to start to get. On that also, they will hold back. I mean, they will rather put money into government treasury than anything else. They'll hold back because putting money in government treasury doesn't get you into trouble. Okay, the company does badly, the bank does badly, but how does it matter? You don't get into trouble.
Omkar, the RBI has capped that.
I know, but they're going to take it to as much. I mean, like, you know, the day before yesterday, the auction that they wanted for money to be given to MSMEs, they only took half of it, right? So, but however, having said that, Mihir, I want to say one thing, and Ninan, I want to share this with you and your views, is I think some private sector banks will see a great opportunity. I think my own guess is a bank like HDFC Bank is going to see a great opportunity today, or Kotak will see a great opportunity today more than others, because others will kind of go back, and these guys still have the firepower to go forward. So I don't know how it will play out, but I suspect the share of lending of the private sector banks, particularly to MSMEs and retail, will go up.
Mr. Ninan, I mean, you know, one of the things that you hear a lot of people, we've been talking about over the past couple of years, has been this sort of growing fintech sector that we hope will be able, you know, to sort of revolutionize retail lending to SMEs and, you know, maybe personal loans. But what appears to be happening on the ground is that these chaps are also being wiped out. And there is no clear way in which we understand how the RBI could support this sort of new sort of NBFC. My question here is, if the PSBs aren't lending, if the sort of fintech revolution is not what's going to bail us out, people survived demonetization. A lot of people survived demonetization through borrowing, through both formal and informal credit. What sort of credit systems are we going to see that's going to keep us going, either households or small and medium enterprises, over the next 8 months?
That is my point, Mihir, that people are going to be risk averse. And the banks will be unwilling to lend. What is the method? The banks lend to the mutual funds or to the NBFCs, and money goes down the system to the retail level. My suspicion is that that chain is already broken a bit, and it's not going to be repaired that soon. So, and my own feeling is slightly different from Omkar's view, that I think banks will go for safety, because you know, capital is going to be stressed if the bad loans go up. So I think they would play for safety rather than say, of course there's opportunity, but you know, money has to come back. Money that you lend has to come back. And if that's risky in environment, partly because of the unpredictability of the whole situation, that you don't really know how it's going to play out, and at which point will something suddenly give in. You would want to protect your cash.
As far as NBFCs are concerned, I have a the last 7, 8 years, I have a ringside view of it. I've been a member of the board of Bajaj Finance, so I have a pretty good idea of how a very successful NBFC functions. Um, I think in many ways, the bellwether of NBFCs, the better ones, the better ones would probably be a dozen altogether, a dozen which are adequately capitalized and have got enough ammunition. It will depend on exactly what Ninan said, that how are they going to and at what rate are they going to get finance from the banks? Because the largest source of borrowing of NBFCs for creating assets is bank borrowing. And some have deposits and others, but but basically it's bank borrowing. How banks are going to lend to NBFCs, and there you can't only depend on private sector banks, you will have to borrow from public sector banks, will actually determine, as far as the NBFCs are concerned, the cost of their liabilities, which in turn will determine the cost of their assets, and which in turn will determine how they will diversify their assets or how will they concentrate.
Okay.
It's going to be a long play. I don't think we know how. The prognosis isn't good, but it's a long, long play, and it'll be pretty tortuous.
I do want to move on from this in a bit, but before I do, Omkar, is there something that you think that the RBI should be doing, something further you think the RBI should be doing precisely to ensure that this channel from banks to NBFCs works better, at least in the next couple of months?
The RBI can only nudge, Mihir. They are doing everything to try and do the nudging, right? If the banks don't want to do it, if you brought the reverse repo rate down, the RBI can only nudge. If the banks don't do it, there is only one thing left to do, which is a terrible, terrible thing, okay? Which is that for banks accounting for 70%, 60, 65% of credit, the majority owner of the bank better tell them to do a few things. Though I don't know what the majority owner will tell them, and they also should be careful. But RBI can at best nudge.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're sort of close to winding this up now, but I want to the last couple of questions that I want to ask about are actually about sort of the post-COVID world for us. As and when this lifts, the public health problem goes away, and as we said at the beginning, we still don't know when the actual public health problem goes away. But as and when the public health problem goes away, is there something, do you think that the reform agenda in any way can, return to the government's, the center of the government's mind, or has it, because of this crisis, shifted completely into we need to deal with the social impact of this going forward? Mr. Ninan.
Let me say that the one issue that has come into focus with this crisis is the state and the size of migrant labor. And many of these migrant workers are actually working in large companies on the shop floor. Most companies have three categories of workers. There are permanent employees, there are contract employees, and there are casual employees. And sometimes they're doing the same work for vastly different levels of pay and benefits and security. Now, this whole structure has evolved because your labor laws are as strict as they are, at least on paper. So companies are trying to find ways of being more flexible with their labor through these structures. And what has resulted, therefore, is that you have this so-called informal sector, which should actually belong to the formal sector, but there is no incentive for private firms to bring them into the formal sector. So in some form, you will have to address the dichotomy in the labor market. between this 15-20% formal sector and the 80-85% informal sector. It can be done in a variety of ways, but you have to address this question because you cannot be this strange economy where 85% of workers are as vulnerable as they've been shown to be. Any government that is sensitive to the majority of your workforce has to address this question. So you have to address labor force issues.
Omkar, do you think that there's sort of one big push in some direction that you feel the government will be able to make once this is done?
Well, to begin with, well, we don't know when, once this is done, is going to happen. And before you say the big push, before I go to the big push, let me say the longer this continues in different ways, and I'm not talking of a hard lockdown like we're going through for 40 days, but the longer this goes on, remember that the operationalizing of various forms of lockdown and various forms of what you can't do is happening through fiats of the state governments and the central government and administrative decisions that they're taking. And the longer this goes on, a large number of people in government are going to be playing a role on what you can do, what you can't do, what can be opened, what can't be opened, and in a way, on day-to-day life, recreating the license, control, and permit Raj that we lived in before 1991. And never underestimate the desire of government servants to become Joseph Stalins. Never underestimate it. It's a given. They try to keep it away and they try not to think about it, quite rightly, but it comes out when it is necessary. So I worry of it being longer. The second is two things will have to be played out by Mr. Modi and his team. One is what Ninan is saying, where you need to show a set of moves which take care of the poor, which take care of labor, exactly the way Ninan is saying. You have to show that this is not a one-off, that we are with you all the time. But in order to do that, you also have to come up with some major reforms coming forward. And if we don't do the two of them, especially in the second half of the year, where you know, in the second quarter, you can keep on giving the things that are needed for the poor and the needy. But by the second half of the year, if we don't start announcing a whole bunch of reforms that have been kept on hold, it's not going to work. So you've got to do both of them, not just for signaling to institutional investors and others, but to show that we can run the two together.
Let me come in, Mihir, with one more point which I'd like to make, which is that the heart of any reform is price reform. I mean, you create a market economy through having a system that's run on the basis of prices. And the substantial reform of 1991 was through a variety of price reforms. Now that stopped at a certain stage. And we have price distortions operating through the Indian economy in a variety of ways, whether it's fertilizer, agricultural commodities, electricity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think given how government finances are going to be affected, given the pressure that will come on the ability to sustain subsidies or to cross-subsidize, I think there will be pressure, and there should be pressure, to look at price reform. There is already a bill which the government is, I think, has circulated or is in the process of circulating, which is trying to end cross-subsidies in electricity. Because you are subsidizing agricultural load, you're subsidizing domestic households, and you're loading all those costs onto industry, which therefore can't compete and are paying crazy electricity rates. So if you stop that as part of a broader effort to try and reform the electrical sector. So there are going to be several areas where government today is facing a loss of revenue or leakages, or the system is suboptimal. I think those areas, I mean, the room for ignoring these issues is going to be much less. And the need to address those issues is going to be much more.
Absolutely right. I couldn't agree with you more, Ryan. Absolutely right.
I mean, I think that's one of the takeaways from this fact that we do have both a crisis in terms of what the government needs to spend and a crisis in terms of what the government receives at the same time. And as Mr. Ninan says, when you do have this kind of combination crisis, I don't think there's much alternative to price reform. Well, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Mr. Ninan. Thank you, Omkar, for being here. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. And thank you, Roli Books, for organizing this. And I'm sure they've got a lot of other stuff planned on Facebook and wherever else. So thank you very much.